Hello and welcome back to my channel and to my series of talks on philosophical novels. Now today I want to talk about this book, Last Men in London by Olaf Stapledon. Now neither that book or the author might be very familiar to you, so let me introduce it. Olaf Stapledon was a British science fiction writer and philosopher, writing mostly in the 1930s and 40s. Now in 1930 he published a quite successful book, Last and First Men. And what it was a history of mankind from that point, from 1932 right to the end of human existence. And humanity goes through various stages. It actually starts colonising other planets in the solar system, and it starts to mutate and evolve, and eventually ends up as this kind of quite alien species on Neptune, where the entire species faces destruction because the sun is going to become a supernova, so all humanity will die. And it's it's written as a history more than as a novel. And it's a quite brilliant sort of expansive look at the future of humanity. It was reasonably successful. So the following year, Stapledon wrote a sequel. Now in this sequel, the last men, these Neptunians, they can project themselves back, telepathically, into the minds of previous human beings living in previous eras. So one of these Neptunians projects himself back into the mind of Paul, who is a young Englishman living in pre-First World War England. And this Neptunian follows Paul's life through to the early 1930s, right? So that's the idea. You're getting the evocation of a young man's mind from that period of the early 20th century from a Neptunian point of view. Now, obviously, Stapledon is using this conceit to do a kind of autobiography, right? And it's clear that this Paul is a substitute for himself. We know this because many of the facts in Paul's life are the same as those of Stapledon. And most interestingly, I think, and most arrestingly in the book, is Stapledon's attitude to the First World War. Stapledon was a conscientious objector, or Conchi as they were known in the UK, a much derided group of people. They were hated, And because he was a conscientious objector, he was forced into becoming an ambulance driver. He worked in the ambulances and the front in France. And this book gives a very, very warts and all portrait of that existence. And then you see Paul goes back into civilian life. He becomes a teacher, but it's not satisfying for him. He tries to find out about the world. He starts reading philosophical texts and so on, just as Stapledon himself became a writer and a philosopher. So you can see it's a kind of coded autobiography. And all through this autobiography, right, the Neptunian acts like a kind of superior consciousness who pushes him forward and tries to make him more aware of the world he's in, right? So you can see that there's a slight triteness here. There's a slightly adolescent idealism at work, which Stapledon could be accused of. Because, for example, when he sees the body of a friend who's killed in the First World War, the Neptunian says, and I made him see that this was true of all human existence or something, and he faints. It's kind of a little bit crass, right? It's on the edge of being a bit trite, so that any kind of, humanistic, spiritual, more macroscopic idea of the world comes from Neptune and not from this sort of base earthling. It plays with being a bit stupid. We'll look at that a bit more later on. The great value of this book is its portrait of the First World War. I have never come across in any book, TV series or film such a passionate and intense and descriptive idea of what it was like to be a sensitive, educated person at the outbreak of the First World War in Britain. We don't really look at this very carefully. We know from poetry and from popular culture that there was this huge outpouring of patriotism, and loads of young men went to the enlisting offices and enlisted to go into the army. And then there were all these patriotic songs. I mean, there was one written for women, to encourage their men to go out to war. It was, oh, we don't want to lose you, but we think you ought to go. And all this rubbish. And you see it here from the point of view of an educated man who thinks that war is horrible and brutal. And it really made me think how I would feel in that position and the contempt and the disgust I would feel, because I'm sure all of us at some point of our lives, you go through this kind of false patriotism when your country's in a state of war, and you get used to the ridiculous propaganda that comes out of the media. But it becomes a part of a historical pattern, right? So you put it to one side. But in this book, you really relive how it felt to be disgusted by what was happening, to be appalled by the sort of vulgarised propaganda that came out. And I think that that's the great value of this book, actually, beyond its philosophy. But let's get to the philosophy. Now, Stapledon's basic approach is this. And this, I think, is the result of two great impacts on human philosophy in the 1800s. One was Karl Marx, and Stapledon was a Marxist and a sort of proto-communist, and someone who thought that the greatest chance for humankind in his time was the Russian Revolution. Now, this is an Englishman writing in 1933. Given what Stalin had already got up to, you could say it was incredibly short-sighted and indulgent for a British intellectual to so unreservedly praise the Russian Revolution, right? And Stapledon tries to almost quasi-excuse Stalin by saying that the Russian Revolution was betrayed because it tried to fall in with the status that was set by the West, the same status. So he's trying to say that the revolution was pure, but it was corrupted by it attempting to compete with the West. I don't think I can follow that line of thinking. I think that line of thinking itself is rather corrupt. But let's go back to the original philosophy. So Marx had a huge impact on late 1800s thinking, and the other thing was, of course, the theory of evolution from Darwin. And this leads Stapledon to a line of thinking which is set off, triggered by the First World War. That what is happening is that this ape-like simian species, man, is developing technologically and in terms of science faster than he is developing spiritually, right? So you can see how Marx and the theory of evolution are coming together to form a point of view. So man is not now a distinct, definite entity put down by God. He's a developing thing that comes into our consciousness, right? And maybe he's not quite there yet. Maybe there's something better around the corner. And maybe that something better is a new political and economic structure for your society, right? So that's where Stapledon is coming from. And his idea of the First World War is that what has happened here is that we've developed machine guns and cars and all the accoutrements of a technological society before we have the brains and the spirituality to really cope with it. And Stapledon's contention is that after this big trigger event, the war to end all wars as people saw it then, there had to be a change in society. Now, this is not unique to Stapledon. If you look across writing and art, from the 1910s through to the 1940s, all of it feels that there's got to be a change. Now, this is mostly moving in a sort of leftist direction. But also there's the kind of futurism coming out of Italy. There's this idea that the new technical, highly urbanized world we live in is changing humanity, and we've got to somehow change with it. Again, feeding back into Darwinism, that we can evolve and change. But how do we change? Now, this is where Stapledon as a philosopher is interesting. You see, Stapledon thinks, in a way, his view is quite despairing and is, overtly idealistic at the same time, because Stapledon chooses to look at humanity in the round, right? He chooses to take a sort of godlike view, a Neptunian view. So he thinks, well, currently as we are, in the current physical and psychological development, we can't really progress. In other words, we're going to have to collapse and rise again. So a new kind of humanity comes forth, moves humanity forward a bit, then they collapse. Then a third type of human species comes along on Mars or wherever. Do you see what I mean? There's something a little bit crass about that, but it gives you an insight into the almost apocalyptic sense in which people in the 20s and 30s felt that there had to be change. But Stapledon can't really seem to see that change on a basic human level, right? Let's contrast this for a moment with another writer writing at the time, George Orwell. Now, George Orwell was a socialist, lifelong leftist, like Stapledon. But there is a huge difference in George Orwell's approach. Orwell wants to get down to ground level. Orwell is a matter-of-fact, person, and he's willing to compromise, and he's willing just to see things that could work. He's not interested in ideals, he's interested in practicalities. So, for example, Orwell constantly criticised the left in England for running down patriotism, right? Because it's not practical. If you create a sense of disbelief and a lack of community amongst people, they're not going to have the strength to, say, fight fascism when it comes along. So Orwell's idealism was very practical. He says you've got to deal with what you've got. It's no good trying to change England or the English people. Instead, what you do is you work with the characteristics of that people to get a better society. Stapledon goes above that. And in a way, I think he undoes himself a bit. He's not able to take that basic matter-of-fact line that Orwell is. He can only look at it either godlike or in total misery, looking at the horror of it all. There's a strange kind of misanthropy here. So, for example, that twice in this book, Stapledon comes very close to dismissing the modern human being of 1933 and wanting to replace them either with a Neptunian, this kind of superhuman that lives on Neptune at the end of thousands of centuries, or at the end of the book, he preempts his later novel Odd John by saying what arises is this new kind of mutant being who've got superpowers, but they seem, because their ideas are so brilliant, they seem like idiot savants to people around them. They seem like sort of mentally handicapped children because they take longer to develop because their ideas are so strong. And another way of looking at this, therefore, is that what Stapledon is creating is Übermensch, that sort of Nietzschean Hitler idea of the more superior human being. It's strange that a Marxist in his idealism is coming closer to that idea of misanthropy or racial superiority than someone like Orwell. You see, for example, when Stapledon is characterising Neptune, one of the things that he believes in is telepathy. This is one way that Stapledon believes that human beings will become better, by being able to understand each other's thoughts. And he talks about a racial mind. So that in Neptune in the future, each human being is part of one racial mind. You see, the language there is quite uncomfortable. The second species he discusses, this kind of new mutant individual that arises among human beings, arises among these human apes, that's got more intelligence, more insight, has got some kind of telepathic ability. Again, it's almost the language of eugenics. The language of a better people who should be bred in defiance of those lesser people who we should stop breeding. It's fascinating how the language of the left in this time comes perilously close to the language of the right. We see this in other ways. For example, I was struck when I watched Bertolt Brecht's one actual contribution to cinema. It's a film called Kula Vampa, which was made in 1934. And what you see in that film is something that I've seen in many leftist philosophers and writers, is an absolute contempt for the proletariat culture. And the working class people are just portrayed as brawling, having lots of drink, having lots of sex. And in the film, some of that proletariat wakes up and realises what, gets a greater conscience. And we see that Brecht and the filmmakers portray them as getting involved in loads of sports and getting involved in lots of, organised activity. And the portrayal of this sports and organised activity is perilously close to the same imagery that Leni Riefenstahl uses in Olympia in 1936, her Nazi-approved portrait of the 1936 Olympics, full of, statuesque white people in beautiful poses, sort of godlike. It's fascinating how close Brecht, almost unconsciously, unironically, comes to the same imagery as Riefenstahl. And here I think Stapledon comes perilously close to a kind of fascism, to a kind of misanthropy of, boring everyday people, and wanting to raise them up to being to some kind of Superman, which is miles away from Orwell's philosophy of getting down in the reality of people. Sort of, for example, when he writes about the Spanish Civil War, not talking about the ideals and communism, but talking about the actual realities of fighting in that war, and how hunger and cold and pain are far more powerful to the ordinary person fighting those wars than any ideals or political speeches. For example, there's one brilliant scene Orwell talks about when he was engaged in trench warfare in the Spanish Civil War, and it was one cold morning, and he saw one of the fascists get up out of the trench, trying to pull on his trousers, at the same time that he had to run across the trench to send an important message. And Orwell says, I couldn't bring myself to shoot him. Why? Because here was a guy farcically trying to keep his trousers up. And in that moment, I didn't see him as a fascist or as a political entity. I saw him as a human being like me, a bit rubbish, a bit vulnerable, and I couldn't kill him. And to me, that simple humanity clashes with Stapledon's rather unforgiving idealism. On this subject, it's interesting to leap forward a few years to the 1970s. I recently picked up this book, My Cinema by Marguerite Duras. Marguerite Duras, you'll remember, was a major writer. She was part of the Nouveau Roman in France in the 1960s with books like Moderato Cantabile. She was also part of the existentialist set in the 40s. She was a partner of Sartre for a while. And then she was a major writer and filmmaker in France. And this is a series of interviews with her. And I was struck by one particular interview where she talks about how she sees that what they are suffering under in France in the 70s is the dictatorship of the proletariat. By which she means that in 68, May 68, intellectuals and leftists in Paris thought that this was the great chance to change the world, right? And there were riots on the streets of Paris. And she says in this interview, because the proletariat did not go along with that and follow it up, they're worthy of contempt. And there you see, I think, a problem in the leftist intelligentsia that also Stapledon represents, that because the working class are not seen to want this utopian vision that middle-class intellectual, middle-class leftists are giving them, therefore they are worthy of contempt. And I think when you look at the world we live in now, you can see that in action. What's interesting about Stapledon is he started to doubt himself, I think. In this book, what we have this supernatural being from beyond time, the end of humanity, comes back and lodges himself in someone's mind and sort of tries to push him, right, to being a better human being. And it's clear that Stapledon sort of respects and idolises this figure. But after the Second World War, in 1947, Stapledon wrote a book called The Flames. Here's my copy. It's such a rare book that this is a sort of knock-up printout from the university. Now, what's interesting in this rather odd little story is this. There's this guy walking around in the Lake District, and he makes telepathic contact with this spirit. This spirit takes the form of a flame in his fire in his cottage. And he finds out that this flame is a being who is the descendant of these creatures, these living flames, who used to live in the sun. That was their natural habitat. And they created this wonderful telepathic gestalt existence on the sun. But then there was sort of sunbursts, and some of these poor flames found themselves on the planets that were cooling and becoming, this rock that was cooling and becoming planets, and they got trapped. Right? So now one of these flames has reanimated and has made contact with humans that have occupied the planet Earth. And it says to this guy, look, we've got superior intelligence and superior telepathy. We can help push you forward, right? With your skill, your technological skill, and your greater digital, with fingers, digital ability to manipulate things, we can, bring you forward. You've got to accept our control, but we will push you forward. And of course, this becomes an allegory for the capitalist middle class and their, relationship with the working class. That's what capitalists said. Look, we will organise your labour, and that labour will therefore become more efficient and make more money. So it's intriguing, isn't it, that Stapledon, in the 15 years between these two books, sees this kind of supernatural Übermensch go from being our sort of idealised end result, our utopia, to being our exploiter, the danger. Did something happen in the 1940s when Stapledon saw the realities of fascism, and possibly the realities of Stalinism? Did something happen to change his mind? I think it did. It's interesting, I don't know if you find this, but sometimes I find that I'm reading different books at the same time and they start to counterpoint each other and talk to each other. So I'm always reading one literary book, one sci-fi book, one set of supernatural tales, and one non-fiction book. And it just so happened when I was reading my science fiction book, Last Man in London, that I was reading this book, John Banville's The Untouchable. This is also set during the 1930s and 40s. And what it's about, it's a sort of thinly veiled portrait, fictionalisation of Anthony Blunt. He was the person who looked after the Queen's paintings, but he was also involved in the Secret Service and he was spying for Russia. And what is interesting is Banville is a brilliant modern Irish writer, and Banville's portrait of why this man came to be a spy is very interesting. Banville picks up on this 1930s idea that went all through the intelligentsia and all through the educated classes, that something had to change. But Banville portrays it almost as though it's a position that's taken. It's not really felt. It's not really understood. It's almost a fashion. But that fashion was the generator of so much ill. So what Banville has the courage, I think, to say is that this guy who ended up spying on his country had no intention of ever living in Russia, ever living in communism, ever living behind the Iron Curtain, ever seeing that life really take its place in Britain, but just through ideological fashion, picked it almost as what he thought was right. And so the non-fiction book I was reading at the same time was Orwell's Essays. And these three books give a brilliant portrait of the early 20th century and how it's impacted our thinking now. We go from the absolute idealism of Stapledon, the practical, no-nonsense politics of George Orwell, and the hint that all of it was a bit of a fake anyway, a bit of a con, and that we were really acting on our own interests, on our own impulses. We were betraying ourselves by thinking we were taking on these highfalutin positions, when really it was all self-interest. I've been fairly harsh on Stapledon's vision in this video. I want to end by positivity. The thing about Stapledon is that though he was a political idealist, and sometimes I think rather unrealistically so, I think he's saved in the end, because what you see in Stapledon, and he writes this in this kind of autobiography, is that he was not a political animal, and nor was he really as someone who wants to set manifestos. He is ultimately a writer. And you see this, there's a wonderful scene where Paul, his alter ego, is sitting on top of an omnibus in London, and he looks down at the streets of people beneath him, and he thinks, what are these people thinking? What do they make of this universe that I'm finding so problematic? And he goes down amongst the crowd, and you get all these character types that Stapledon writes about. And that's where Stapledon's language is really rich and beautiful. Ultimately, Stapledon is a humanist. He cares about human beings. That's something he shares with Orwell. Both of them, though Stapledon is an idealist, Orwell is a realist, both of them put human beings before their politics. And I think that's what saves Stapledon and makes him such a beautiful writer. I also, what I like about Stapledon is something that I've been criticising in this video, and that is that, as you get older, right, when you're young, you're supposed to ask those questions. What am I doing here? Why was I born? What does it all mean? And as we get older and more mature and more sophisticated, apparently, we're not supposed to ask those questions. Those questions are supposed to be jeune or adolescent, but they're not. They always remain relevant. And what I kind of admire about Stapledon in this book is he opens up his soul. He's a man who says, look, I want to show you what I'm thinking. I want to ask all those questions. He sort of almost embarrasses himself. He exposes himself. But I like that. I like that he exposes that slightly juvenile side of his mind because it's there in all of us. I mean, for example, his discussion of sex, for its time, is extraordinary. He talks about how, he was straining to lose his virginity and how he felt that was sort of curdling his mind and his aims and his desires. And he talks about how this ex-girlfriend of his realises that he's in trouble. And even though she's married and with children, she talks to her husband and says, look, I better sort this guy out. And they go off for this holiday together in Wales. I mean, it's kind of toe-curlingly embarrassing, but it's extraordinarily honest. And it lets you into his whole field of vision. Consider this sentence, for example, where Stapledon goes through the different kinds of writers who are trying to deal with the current situation in the 1930s. And he writes this sentence: some whose sole care was to avoid the taunt of credulity and the taunt of emotionalism, fastidiously, elegantly, shook off from their fingers the dust of belief, the uncleanness of enthusiasm. Now, compare that to someone like Evelyn Waugh, whose literary career started going in the 1930s, and his furious denial of any kind of real emotional or psychological complexity in the way he writes. Waugh was always saying, I'm just writing for the joy of language, And compare that to the sort of Stapledon's deep dive into his own sometimes adolescent, sometimes embarrassing inner life. His end idea is that the greatness of the cosmos that we live in is almost like a sort of great music. So it's a music that we can't hear or that we only interpret every so often in our greatest works of art or our greatest insights. But this music is constant, and we've got to raise ourselves up to a level to almost hear it and be part of it. It's interesting, isn't it, how a leftist Marxist writer of the 1930s goes back to the sort of religious symbolism of the medieval world, of Dante's Inferno, of going into a heaven, circles of people endlessly singing. It's strange how he reinstates that. I find that really fascinating, and it's interesting to note that Stapledon in the late 1930s himself wrote a kind of rewrite, a science fiction rewrite of Dante's Divine Comedy called Star Maker, which is arguably his greatest achievement. Ultimately, this is not a book for everybody. It's not really a novel. It's a kind of autobiography, and you almost feel reading it that you're reading someone's diary to themselves. There's almost a slightly embarrassment about reading it. I found that fascinating. I found that for the first time in my life, I really understood the intellectual mindset of someone in that time, of a leftist idealist, of someone who'd gone through the war as a conscientious objector, as a pacifist, and what that felt like. And if you're interested in those things, I really strongly recommend this book. It's quite hard to find, but it's a really fascinating insight into a really intelligent and sensitive mind. Thanks very much.